Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. If you ever wonder why the federal government is in the business of running your local school district from 3,000 miles away, you're not alone. In fact, the idea that education policy should be dictated by Washington, D.C. rather than parents, teachers, and communities was never a given in American life. And for most of our nation's history, there was no federal Department of Education. Enters 2025, and with it, a proposal from the Trump administration: shut it down, not streamline it, not reform it, eliminate it. And today we're joined by someone who knows this issue inside out, Lindsey Burke. She's the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. We'll talk about the origin of the department, its ballooning influence over the decades, and what education might look like in a world where the feds take a backseat. Welcome, Lindsey.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, before we start, I want to ask you, how did you get to do the job that you do and pick education policy as your field of expertise?
Ooh, I wasn't expecting that question. Thanks. So I have been at the Heritage Foundation for 17 years now. I came in 2008, which is dog years in DC, right? Mm-hmm. So a long time. I came by way of, I did a brief stint as a long-term substitute French teacher in Central Virginia. So teaching high school there briefly, and had done that stint after I had completed a master's in foreign language education at the University of Virginia. And then decided to move up to Washington. There was a position that had opened up at Heritage. I had always, as dorky as this sounds, I had always wanted to work at Heritage for as long as I could remember, reading their white papers in high school. And when a job opened up, I hopped on the opportunity and moved to Washington, and have been there ever since. Did a PhD after I got to Heritage about a decade in. At George Mason in education policy and research methodology. And the position at Heritage was the perfect marriage of political theory and education. So it's been a wonderful opportunity all these years, and is more exciting today, I can say confidently, than it has ever been.
So let me ask you something, actually. Do you think your experience as a teacher kind of adds to your to the job that you do?
It definitely does. I mean, you really do get insight on the ground into what the day-to-day struggles are and what works day-to-day. I mean, you need and what's not working, right? Nothing that, as wonderful as my college experience was, as wonderful as University of Virginia is, everything that I gleaned from doing a master's of teaching, none of that was applicable to the classroom, right? I mean, you cover so much theory, right? I mean, I have yet to implement Vygotsky's zone of proximal development in like my day-to-day life. And so, you learn all of this sort of esoteric theory that's not applicable, and yet you don't really learn how to design a good lesson plan or what classroom management strategies work effectively. And so that's just one example of what has animated our policy work is, we're doing everything we can right now to remove those barriers at the state level, which really are, at the end of the day, occupational licensure barriers to the classroom. Remove those barriers, let anybody with content matter and subject knowledge expertise enter the classroom without having to get the blessing of the state in order to do so. And then give them some support around things like classroom management and, lesson plan design, and let them do what they do best. So that's one example I would give you.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let's start. So the Department of Education was only created in 1979. So what was the original justification for creating a Department of Education? By the way, I didn't actually realize it was so recent.
It's so new.
And yeah, it's really so recent. And I guess I knew this on some part of my brain, and also how. So what was the justification for it?
Well, the justification was efficiency. So you have to go back about 20 years prior to the war on poverty. So Lyndon Johnson launches the war on poverty in 1965. And that was really the first significant federal intervention, I call it. Try not to call it a federal role because there is not one, but the first significant federal intervention in education. In 65, we get the federal Head Start program. We get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which still today governs all federal K-12 programs and spending, with the exception of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we get the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was the first broad-based student lending. It was underwritten. It was still private. It was underwritten with the full faith and credit of Uncle Sam. But we get all of this federal intervention in 65, from pre-K all the way through higher ed.
I never realized that actually 65... Yes. That they had an education component to the war on poverty.
In fact, the president, so Lyndon Johnson, said 1/3 of the war on poverty would be fought in the classrooms of America. So the Great Society initiatives, a third of it really was an education initiative. And we spent over $3 trillion just at the federal level since then. But the reason why that plays into the Department of Ed getting created was that you get myriad programs out of the war on poverty, dozens upon dozens of discrete programs, and they were all in health, education, and welfare, and sort of in disparate places throughout the federal government. And so when Carter comes along and tries to make the argument for the department, even he was initially queasy, as many people were at the time, about creating a standalone cabinet level federal agency for education, which is a quintessentially state and local issue. Carter says, well, it'll create these efficiencies. We can house all of these Great Society era programs under one roof. It'll just work better. Now, that was his stated rationale. The real reason was that Carter wanted to become president. And so if you look at what was happening during that election cycle in 76, the teachers' unions were newly powerful. They decided for the first time ever to issue a presidential endorsement. Walter Mondale was, of course, Carter's running mate for VP. At the time, his brother was a higher up in the NEA. And so Carter made two promises. He said, I will tap Walter Mondale as my VP running mate, and I will create a cabinet level agency for education. And so he made those two promises. He kept good on those two promises. He got the endorsement of the teachers unions, and that catapulted him to the presidency.
Well, so basically originally it was just like, let's put all these things together. In a way, it's kind of the equivalent of what they done with the CFPB, the Consumer Protection Agency, whatever. Because it was like there were a lot of protections, like at the Fed, at the SEC, at the blah blah blah, and they kind of say, let's create. So it's the story that's been that we've seen done over and over again. So it's kind of let's consolidate, let's put all this under one roof, and then what happened? Like, how did it evolve?
Right.
What went wrong, Lindsey?
Yeah. Well, education didn't get any better. Right?
Yeah.
Like I said, we spent $3 trillion since then, just at the federal level, which for your listeners who might not follow it that closely, the federal component is only 10% of everything that we spend in this country on K-12 education. Right. So not only is it not an enumerated power of the federal government, but the federal government's a small relative stakeholder in its financing. States and localities pay for 90% of all K-12 spending. And so you have to keep that 10% figure in mind.
It used to be more.
It did it's ebbed and flowed over the years, but right now it's about 45-45 on average state local. So about 45% of revenue comes from states, about 45% from localities, and about 10% from the federal level. That ratio used to be much different. If you go back 100 years, it was more like 80% local, right? And then a small state share, and the federal share was non-existent. So that federal share has been growing, but it's been around 10%. And so you have to keep that 10% figure in mind, because it shows you how massive that $3 trillion number is, right?
Yeah.
And we've spent $3 trillion just at the federal level, just on K-12. I'm not even talking higher ed here, just K-12. And so we've spent this massive amount of money, and kids can't read or do math. And so the outcome of the Department of Ed has not been anything by way of educational improvement, academic excellence, achievement gaps, by the way. So the gap between the bottom and top deciles of by family income distribution for
It's
kids.
growing, right?
It's growing now post COVID, but if you take the long view, completely unchanged. So if you go back to 65, when Johnson launches the war on poverty, that gap between the bottom 10% and the top 10% by income was 4 grade levels worth of learning. That's a huge gap. 4 grade levels. Today, it is 4 grade levels worth of learning. So we have not narrowed that gap whatsoever. And that really was the stated rationale for the war on poverty, right? It was a war on poverty. We want to help low income kids.
They sorry for interrupting. Yep. They had a theory. I assume they had a theory, which is a pretty good one, that education is actually kind of very instrumental to income mobility, I assume, or to kind of, I mean,
that's right. The problem is the way that they operationalized it was antithetical to actually having those improvements. When you have a monopoly system, which is effectively what we've had, right? Which you'll appreciate, but for the past, 100 years, when you have a monopoly provision of a service, you have no competitive pressure to improve. And it's worse than that with K-12 education, because schools that underperform, right, failing schools, historically have gotten additional federal money. And so in a way, we've rewarded underperformance, unfortunately, rather than saying these schools aren't performing well, no kids should be assigned to them based on their parent's zip code. Let's fund the child directly with this money and then allow them to attend a school that works for them. So I think you're right in that that's the goal, the hope, right, is that you fund education, it improves outcomes. But it hasn't been the case because of the monopoly provision.
It's kind of interesting because this is an important point. I never really quite thought about education, and I started thinking about it. I mean, obviously, it was behind kind of the conservative libertarian stuff about getting rid of the Department of Education, and that should be a private function or a state, at the very least, state and local level, certainly not a federal function. But during COVID, I live in Arlington, and they closed the schools, and they didn't even require the kids to kind of have their camera on and or do their homework or anything. They just basically dropped educating children. And so I had a bunch of conversation with the superintendent, like kind of things that I would never do. And it forced me to think. And I thought, and one of the things I told him, I said, I mean, the number one goal of government education is to actually educate the children, right? That should be kind of the number one goal. And if you think about who really you're serving, you should be serving the underserved population the most.
Yeah, that's right.
Like that's who you're thinking about. I mean, my kids were fine, right? Yeah. I mean, they're just like, my daughter was like in a challenging math class. I realized they weren't going to get the trigonometry. She did the varsity tutor online, and she got that education. Like, it was just like, but I was thinking like, they're not going to catch up. And it's the first time kind of I got to thinking about, if we're going to have government involvement in education, what is the goal? And the goal, I mean, if we think the goal is education of those who wouldn't get educated otherwise, right?
Yeah.
And it's just kind of, we're spending all of this money to give a free ride to lots of kids while kind of just not improving the lives of.
Yeah. And this is the thing, right? I mean, Milton Friedman, of course, recognized this all the way back in 1955. He publishes The Role of Government in Education, and this is the seminal tract. It's pithy if nobody's read it. It's a short little essay that he wrote where he first operationalized the idea of a school voucher. He said, yes, of course, let's publicly finance education. We're going to do that. So take that off the table. But the public financing does not require government administration of schooling. And so let's fund the families directly and separate the financing from the delivery of services. And out of that idea came the school voucher idea, which remained an academic idea until the 1990s, where we start to get a few school choice programs.
Under
But the
Clinton,
history,
right?
yeah. So the first choice program modern day that we get is in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then we get Pennsylvania, Ohio, get a few voucher programs. Bill Clinton actually vetoed what would have been a school voucher program in Washington, D.C. at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually George W. Bush signed it into law in 2004. But then we get more and more school choice programs in the states, but they still just kind of slowly piddle along until 2011. And in 2011, we had 12 states that year adopt some sort of school choice program, either a voucher, tax credit, or for the first time an education savings account. And that's why 2011 is such a pivotal year for school choice advocates, is because Arizona said Milton Friedman's school voucher idea was really great, but he had an even better idea in 2006. He gave an interview with Ed Next and he said, well, why should you have to spend all of your voucher at one school? Why not French at one school, English at another, math at another? Why not partial vouchers? Yeah. And so that idea of partial vouchers laid the groundwork for education savings accounts, which Arizona then adopted in 2011. And today we have, depending on how you count them, 18 or 19 states with education savings accounts in place, which are just this phenomenal refinement of the school voucher model. And by the way, we have now 14 states with totally universal school choice. That number 4 years ago, pre-COVID, was 0. Not a single state in the country had universal choice open to everybody. And it's 15 today, 14, depending. We go back and forth on Indiana. It's 97% eligibility.
That's amazing. Yeah. But you said something important about how the department was created.
Yeah.
And you can see why it was impossible to actually, split the money from the administrating. If part of the decision of creating the Department of Education was a gift to the unions,
yes,
then it's end of conversation.
That's
right. Because they're not in the money they're not in the money in the funding thing. They're in the administrative side of the
and they're not in the kid side of it. They're in the adult side of it. And so to your point earlier, all the unions do is, and look, that's their model, right? And fine, but they're there to look out for the adults in the system, not the kids. And so of course the unions agitated to get a federal agency in place because it made it so easy for them. It's centralized power and one shop for them to be able to lobby at, and really concentrate their power. And the people who can navigate Washington are the special interest groups like the unions. It's not your average day American. And, a lot of people have been making this point over the past couple of months as the administration has done really good work, in my opinion, to start the process of abolishing the agency. But, it doesn't educate a single child. It doesn't run a single school. It doesn't pay a single teacher salary. It's just, to your point, an administrative body.
So should break it down for us. So what is the local side of education? What is it? What's its responsibility, state versus federal at this point?
So local's where it's at, right? So the local side is, 90% of what we see with regard to responsibility in education. So you have, of course, local school districts, which are political divisions in a way, but local school districts that are managing schools and create the boundaries around which kids are assigned. They're hiring the teachers, they're hiring the principals, they're putting policies in place that shape the school day, contracts, et cetera. They do all of the day-to-day work of educating children in the local schools at the district level. And again, on average, 45% of their revenue is coming from local taxpayers, primarily through local property taxes. And so then if you go up a level higher, what does the SEA, the state education agency, do? Well, largely it serves to translate federal policy to the local school districts. Federal regulations and red tape runs through an SEA. The SEA then sends that back down to the local school district. And so there is this parasitic relationship of sorts with the SEA, the state education agency, and the federal Department of Ed. I say this for a few reasons. One, they really are creatures of the federal.
So they didn't really exist? Did they not really exist?
they did exist prior. So I wouldn't say they're creatures of the federal agency, but they are creatures of federal involvement in education.
Or maybe their eyes before were on the local government, when now their eyes are on the federal government.
That's exactly right. And this is another really important point, because if you are in the business of trying to wind down the Department of Ed, part of the goal is what you just said. We want to create horizontal accountability to parents and to taxpayers, rather than this vertical faux accountability, which isn't accountability at all, to Washington, which is what we get with a federal agency. So the other thing to note is that Jonathan Butcher at Heritage, he found that 41% of the salaries at state education agencies are directly paid by the federal government. And so again, this is like really an outgrowth of ever-growing federal intervention in education, that we get these state ed agencies. But the job that they do, they are responding to the federal government. They're applying for federal competitive grants. They are making sure that funds are delivered to the local levels. They are monitoring Federal Register notices. They're reporting back on their progress. So they're the sort of intermediary compliance agent between the local school districts and the feds. And then the feds, so there are, I would argue, two things that they're doing: civil rights protections and distributing money, either via formula or competitive grant, back to states. And I say distributing money, right? I mean, they're taking money from local taxpayers. They're forcing you to send it to Washington. They're filtering it through this federal Department of Ed, and then they're sending it back to the states, and they think somehow that will improve academic outcomes.
Sounds like the gas tax,
yes,
which is collected. It's collected at the at the local level. Again, goes and runs through the Department of Transportation, and then is sent back to the states based on a kind of a just stupid formula.
That's right.
With some of it, cut out to pay the bureaucrats in Washington and at the state level.
And that's exactly it. And so there was a report, it's old now, but I still cite it because it's the best report that's ever existed, in my opinion, on education policy at the federal level. Education at a Crossroads, which came out in 1998. So Pete Hoekstra, former congressman, ran a commission, the Hoekstra Commission, and they produced a report in 98. They had gone around the country, interviewed schools, done multiple hearings at the state level. They did federal hearings. They would go over to the federal Department of Ed and just show up unannounced and say, hey, what do you do here? You guys asked for this report. Like, where is it? Anyways, they produced this beautiful report. And in that Crossroads report, they found that only 65 cents of every dollar makes it back to the classroom that the feds take. So, you're sending it to Washington, 65 cents, and it's all getting taken on administrative overhead.
But so one of the things I learned when they went and cut 1,300 people from the Department of Education, that was 50%. It's like, what are those 2,600 people? I've seen various numbers. I don't know what your number is, but what are?
I can tell you exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So how many people work for the Department of Education? What do they do, and where does the money go?
Yeah. So it's a good question on what they do. It would be fascinating. I haven't done the work yet to look at exactly which positions were. People have. There are a couple of different analyses out there that show exactly which positions were sliced. I haven't looked at it yet. They did basically an across-the-board 50% RIF at the agency. However, although that sounds like a blunt instrument, they made sure that for areas where one could argue there is a more appropriate federal role, for instance, for students with special needs, they didn't just cut 50% at that office. So they were more targeted in those cuts. But in general, they cut 50% across the board at various offices within ed. So when President Trump took office this time around, there were 4,133 people at the Department of Ed. And today they're down to 2,183. So some of those were voluntary buyouts. Some of those were just the RIF, the reduction force. But yeah, half. And so this is, it's pretty incredible. That alone is incredible. And then 2 days later, so that was March 11th. 2 days later a week later on March 20th, we get the executive order that says, and all the EO says is the president directs the secretary to, quote, take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Ed to the maximum extent permitted by law. And so implicit in that is she's going to have to work with Congress. But we get that EO. And then 2 days after the EO comes out, the president's giving a talk about something unrelated to education and mentions in the course of that talk that student loans would be, quote, coming out of the Department of Ed immediately, as would funding for kids with special needs. That would go over to HHS. Student loans would go to the Small Business Administration. And this is important, I think, as a goal for winding down the department, because student loans are more than half of what the department does. And so if they are able to successfully extricate student loans from the Department of Ed, then I think, and you've already got half of the people gone, then I think you're looking at a federal agency with a handful of K-12 programs that they're operating. It's going to be really hard to make the case. We need a cabinet level agency on par with the Department of Defense to manage a couple of K-12 programs. And so I think that will help tremendously.
So there's the same number of people working for the Department of Education?
Not as the Department of Defense. So just saying, like, the argument, like a cabinet level agency.
Yeah, at the cabinet level.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
So the question, though, is like, because one of the things, like, right, I mean, in the private sector, you have increased productivity. You always try to get more and better stuff for cheaper and with using fewer resources, right? That's what increased productivity. In government, it's exactly the opposite. You get like the same level of output, and yet it costs more. You need more people. You just kind of, you weigh the system down, and that's in the best case scenario, because usually actually you get decline in outcomes. But so, is there a chance that, for instance, in shifting these programs to other agencies? So, for instance, like, I mean, I would love to see the Small Business Administration disappear personally.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I have trepidation about them getting kind
and
of
they've cut
another
43% of their staff at SBA.
But, so are they in the transition? Are we also getting kind of them saying something like, and you have to do the same with less?
So I think with the student loan example, the ink is still wet on where student loans will ultimately go. They could go to Treasury. They could end up at SBA. We could see a situation where that's split, where SBA would originate new loans and Treasury would deal with things like defaults and deferments. So we'll see what ultimately happens. Treasury also has a lot of the information that would be helpful in collections, right? So they've got all the IRS data on borrowers. So there's also that. So, as far as the economies of scale or whatever we might gain from some of these reductions, all of this is contingent on actually cutting programs and spending. And we've always thought about this as a 3-part test. Is a program ineffective? Is it duplicative? Is it inappropriate at the federal level? If it's any of those things, it needs to go. And there's only so much that the administration, of course, can do unilaterally. And so now it really is, with that executive order, they really did throw the ball to Congress. And so Congress now has a couple of bites at the apple. Hopefully they have the appetite to eat the apple. In that they will go through a reconciliation process pretty soon, although who knows, pretty soon could be Christmas for all we know at this point. And the appropriation cycle, which will certainly be, May, June, will kick off the summer. With reconciliation, of course, you can only tackle mandatory spending, but that means they could eliminate some of the largest student loan programs that should be eliminated. The PLUS loan program, the federal taxpayer should not be funding graduate students, like, period. No. And I think there's an appetite among conservatives in particular to eliminate PLUS. So certainly among conservatives, but I think even the center-right members of Congress, I think they understand that PLUS is inappropriate, to put it lightly, at the federal level. So we could eliminate PLUS as part of reconciliation. There's some other things that you can do in reconciliation, but then that still leaves all the K-12 programs. And then
I guess it would also be a good thing, because it would actually be a way to offset the tax.
Yes.
The extension of the tax cuts. How much money are we talking about?
So for PLUS, we think it's about $40 billion over 10. So, not nothing.
No. No.
Yeah. So a non-trivial amount of money in PLUS, just in PLUS. And so then the K-12 programs, so they're all discretionary spending. And so that, you, of course, can't tackle in reconciliation. So that's where we've got to wait on the appropriation cycle to kick off in the summer. And hopefully at that point, we will see a member introduce a full-scale comprehensive bill to wind down the department as an amendment to the labor age bill, most likely.
Well, so I saw that Senator Bill Cassidy has actually introduced a bill, right?
So yeah, I hadn't seen that yet. As of
I
yesterday.
just saw a headline. I didn't.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That I know. I hadn't seen a bill yet, but he has expressed interest. I know publicly in leading on that, which is great because he's the chair of the Senate Help Committee, and so that's the other reason I'm excited that we might actually see this happen. Right? Like for so long, people laughed. Like I used to say under their breath, but they just laughed right? At this idea that we could actually eliminate the department.
Oh, no. I mean, eliminating the Department of Education was always on my list of stuff that we needed to eliminate. Did I ever think that? No, never.
I keep saying this to people, like the point that we're at right now in ed policy, just to like take a second to appreciate it, like that we're on the cusp of potentially, and we have a long way to go, but potentially eliminating the Department of Ed for real. And simultaneously, we're seeing universal school choice in the states go gangbusters. I mean, if you had told me 5 years ago we would have a single state with a universal school choice program, I would have been surprised. That we're at 15 and we could be at 18 by the end of the year. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Amazing.
So anyway, so we'll see what happens with the comprehensive bill. But, if you have leadership on Senate Help and leadership on the House Ed and Workforce Committee running with it, and you've got the administration behind you, you've got the president, you've got the Secretary of Education, of course, that's supportive of winding down her own agency. I mean, it's a beautiful time to try.
How many do they need? Do they need 60 votes in the Senate?
They do. And so so
is there any chance to get any Democrats?
Right. I mean, this is going to be obviously the hard part. This is why doing everything that can be done in reconciliation is important, because you only need 50. The 60 vote threshold, of course, is obviously a lot harder to hit. I think this is why I said earlier, if we can get the department to the point where it's really just administering some of the K-12 programs, that's going to be helpful to make the case. And maybe there are compromises that can be made moving forward in order to get over that hurdle. Not that I would support this per se. However, many people have made the point that you could potentially compromise on things like increasing spending on IDEA for students with special needs in exchange for we move IDEA over to HHS and eliminate the rest of the remaining programs and departments. So, could it be compromises like that win the day? Potentially. But it's going to be tough. The other thing I would say really quickly is just because that 60 vote threshold is really hard. We have read into the code, U.S. Code 20 that governs education. The secretary has a lot of authority, broad authority, to move programs to other agencies. And so there may be opportunities there that already exist in code for her to move some K-12 programs over. So we'll see.
Yeah. So I heard you talk about how much of the money goes to consultant.
Yeah.
In the Department of Education. And it's kind of, I will say I've done fiscal policy for, a long time. And this is one of the kind of things I never really thought about with DOGE is how much money they're exposing, how much money the federal government, and I assume it's the same at the state and local government, are giving to consulting companies. For what?
Yeah.
Like literally for what? Because they're not even, I mean, if the federal government was getting better, we would know it. and it's not. And it's just like, I was reading at the Wall Street Journal that Booz Allen is getting literally 98% of its revenue from the federal government, right? They're like, and I know McKinsey started like, a few decades ago, like a government consulting business, because, this is recession proof. It doesn't matter that when there's a recession, everyone's losing their jobs. The federal government is Fortune 1 and basically the money keeps flowing. And it's the same. It never occurred to me. At first, I never really actually given much thought about consulting, but of course, it's got to be the same at the education department level. But so what are these consultants hired for?
And I don't have an exact dollar figure for you, other than to say, I know that Nikki Neely and our friends at Parents Defending Education, they did pull numbers on specifically the DEI consultants and the whole DEI infrastructure at the federal level. And I mean, the numbers were eye-popping. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on these consultants. And what are they for? I mean, a lot of this is navigating the bureaucracy that the feds create in the first place. If schools want to get their money back that they have been forced to send to Washington, they have to navigate all of these. If they want money for teacher professional development, they have to go through Title II of ESEA in order to get the money that they've been forced to send to Washington, right? Like, the formula programs, those are on autopilot. And so they're going to get them, but that's not the bulk of it's the bulk of the money, but it's not the bulk of the programs. And so there are dozens upon dozens of these little competitive grant programs that schools and districts and states have to apply for. And so, of course, that means that you've got personnel in SEAs and LEAs, the states and the local ed agencies, dedicated to doing that. You've got many, many, many people employed in Title I offices and Title II offices, people employed to make sure, and, some of these, of course, are necessary, but that, schools are complying with all civil rights laws. The one that is, I think, most concerning is with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, where students with special needs and students with disabilities are, in fact, entitled to support and funding and protections under federal law. And yet these families often enter into what can be a litigious process just to get the services to which they're entitled under law. And so there's that aspect of it too. What I found most interesting, and again, I go back to the Education at a Crossroads report because it's so great, was they had a line in that report after canvassing the entire U.S. and doing a deep dive into what the department was, where they said, what has the department accomplished? It's just created a cottage industry of companies popping up across the country to sell information on how to apply for federal programs to get your education money back. I mean, it's unbelievable. So, that's a whole other aspect of the argument that I think is often overlooked. But we have, just at the macro level, right? If we are honest, we have gotten nothing in terms of academic excellence out of creating a department, right? Achievement gaps are as wide as they've ever been. Academic outcomes are flat. A third of kids can read proficiently in this country, which means 70% of them cannot, right? I mean, academic outcomes are lackluster. We're in the middle of the pack internationally. And so,
and we've gone down, right? In terms of
in the post-COVID,
I was having a hard time finding because I wrote a column about abolishing the Department of Education, and I was I was finding contradictory on the PISA ranking. Like some places, because for whatever reason I couldn't find the data that I was looking for, and I was in a hurry, and some people said we were at the top of the list, and then we went down to 18, I think.
I think now. That figure sounds closer. I haven't looked at PISA in a while, but same with TIMSS. I mean, we've been in the middle of the pack historically, and with COVID, testing, COVID compounded a lot of that. But on the domestic assessments, if you look at NAEP, I mean, just since 2015, we've lost about 10 points on the NAEP students have, which, to give you an idea of what that means, 10 points on the NAEP is the equivalent to a grade level worth of learning, right? So you tend to, as you go through the grade levels, you get 10 additional points, right? You tend to score 10 points higher than you did the prior year in math and reading. So it's, outcomes are they're really in the tank right now. I mean, people said it was a bloodbath on the NAEP. There were like 2 states that didn't experience the NAEP bloodbath in 2025. Louisiana was one of them. So, we just, in my opinion, have nothing to show for having a cabinet level agency for education other than concentrating union and special interest authority at the federal level, making it easier for them to lobby for the things that they want. And this bureaucratic boondoggle, to quote Reagan, that simply hasn't and never could. It was never designed for success, right? To situate dollars and decision making in Washington as far removed as you possibly could from the students that these programs affect was never a recipe for success.
Yeah, no, it's quite astonishing. So are they anyone on the left who actually is an ally in this? Because I mean, they should care a great deal.
Yeah.
Now, I understand the country's polarized, so if Trump wants it,
Right.
of course, it means it's horrible, and it just kind of like there are states, right? I mean, are states ever fighting against basically the federal oppression? Are some states fighting back and kind of saying, "Leave us alone. We're going to try to, serve our kids"?
Yeah. So to the first part of the question, we certainly have a road to hoe ahead of us on getting bipartisan support. Historically, there were people in the 60s and 70s on the left who opposed the creation of the department. And then more recently, a year ago, maybe it was, I think Randy Weingarten, who heads the American Federation for Teachers, one of the largest teachers unions in the country, she gave an interview with some TV host, and in the course of that interview had said, we don't really care that much about the debate over the department. We're focused on whatever, families, students, states, whatever she said, which isn't true. But she said in the course of that she wasn't that concerned about it. However, she has since changed her tune, of course, and is out there full-throated in opposition to winding down the department. So it's going to be tough. We do have more, I think, opportunity to work with state and local leaders who are on the left or center left to do this, because everybody experiences the red tape and regulations that are handed down from Washington. And everybody understands at the local level and intuitively that it's not Washington it's driving improvements, if anything, the opposite. And so I think, the onus is on us the onus is on the left to make the case for the department to continue, because we've got 50, almost 45 years of empirical evidence that it hasn't worked. I think the onus is on us to make the case to teachers in particular that this is in their interest, that it is in their interest to have fewer dictates from Washington, to have less red tape and regulations from Washington, and to really empower them. And then I think working with state leaders and state superintendents, there are some excellent state superintendents across the country right now that understand this. Some of them showed up to the White House for the EO signing. There were about 10 governors, maybe 12, who came to that White House executive order signing on winding down the department. And all of that signaled that these are people who are state leaders who are ready to run with the ball, right? So because it does require this federal state choreography, as you wind down federal intervention, it will require states to pick up some of the management of these programs. And, for programs that Washington should not be involved in, which is 99% of them, if states want to continue doing that, they will have to assume revenue responsibility for that. So we need their leadership in that regard too.
Yeah. And it also going to remove the bureaucracy at the state level.
That's right. And so I think for some superintendents and some state level leaders, part of this is going to be having them sort of rethink what their role is in this new environment. And that goes both for no longer having a federal agency, but also as school choice expands. What does it mean to be a state superintendent of public instruction when you have universal school choice, right? Your job is public education, but if we're reconceptualizing public education a la Milton Friedman's vision, that means all education. And so how do they support the expansion of choice, both rhetorically and in practice?
How does the existence of the government of the Department of Education influence private schools?
Right. It doesn't. And so, I mean, I say that, quickly, there are some exceptions, right? So many, not most, a third roughly last time I looked, of Catholic schools participate in Title I programs and services. So there are some instances for
so
low
Title
income.
I, can you remind us?
School districts and other federal programs. So there are some instances where there is overlap between the department or federal programs and the private sector, but it's extremely limited. And so that's the beauty of, I think, in addition to everything else, expanding school choice so that we're just funding families directly. As school choice expands, as more and more students are in private options, that further, diminishes the need, if there ever was one, for federal involvement in education. I mean, there will just be fewer students in traditional public schools as a result of not only school choice, but demographic realities that we're facing as a country, right? I mean, there are just going to be fewer students. And so, you hear people in the public sector sort of gnashing their teeth over the expansion of private school choice. Well, that's really just a sort of blip on the radar when it comes to what could happen with their enrollment. The threat to, for lack of a better word, for enrollment in the public sector isn't school choice, it's demographic declines.
Yes. I mean, so I heard that it's actually, and I think I remember when my daughter, Margot, entered kindergarten, it was a boom year. They had to add kindergarten classes and all this.
Yeah.
And exactly. And I just kind of never really quite thought about it any further. But then recently, recently I saw someone talk about like how no one is talking about what it means when, and it was, I don't know if the number was right, but it was like 25% fewer students throughout the system, whether it's the K-12 or the higher ed.
Yeah. We're going to have a lot of empty school buildings. And so and hey, maybe we convert them to retirement homes. I mean, fix two problems at once.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, so it is a real, and it's roughly 25%.
I hadn't heard that figure, but that's probably right. I mean, it's, people aren't having children. We're far below the replacement rate. We have pressures on both ends, right? The people pulling the cart versus riding in the cart, for lack of a better framing, right? I mean, you've got fewer people having children. You've got massive retirements every day. I mean, Matt Ladner on my team ran the numbers and I forget exactly what he found, but it's something on the order of 10,000 boomers retire every day from now until 2030. And so, these are financial realities and strains on states. And so states, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budgets. And typically K-12 education, or education, I should say, K-12 and higher ed, tends to be the second largest budget item for a state after healthcare. And so this is a reality they're going to have to face.
Medicaid, precisely.
Yeah, right. And so, I see school choice really as a pressure release valve for these states too. I mean, if you look at these programs, we're talking the cost is a fraction of what is spent on kids in the public system. Families are choosing to take less money because they can get a better education for less money in the private sector. Mm-hmm. So, if you look at Arizona, right, kids are getting an ESA that's worth about $7,000 for your sort of, I hate the term, but like typical kid, right? $7,000 they're getting. Meanwhile, they're spending $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 per pupil per year in the state. And so that's saving taxpayers money. We're spending across the country now, on average, $18,000 per pupil per year in the public sector. I mean, it's just an unbelievable amount of money.
Yeah. I mean, it's really quite crazy. So for the people who are kind of worried about what does it look like to kind of end the Department of Education? Like, what are the different steps? How do you see things evolving? I mean, obviously you touched a little bit on this, and I mean, you're optimistic.
Yeah.
And what would the impact be on innovation in education, for instance?
Well, we've certainly not gotten innovation from the federal Department of Ed, so we can only go up from here.
Yeah.
But I think for your typical parent, if you're worried about this or just have questions, even if you think, yes, I'm a great supporter of abolishing the Department of Ed, questions about what it might mean for your kid day to day, every proposal that's out there so far that aims to abolish the department would move programs and spending that are appropriate to other federal agencies. And so those programs and spending would not go away. However, that's a handful of programs, right? So the department does run dozens upon dozens of programs. So for example, the programs that we have recommended keeping and that the administration has signaled they would keep, and I think every proposal in Congress so far that we've seen would keep, are things like IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Funding for that would move to the Department of Health and Human Services, and all of the protections in federal law for students with special needs would stay. And by the way, protections for kids with special needs have been in federal law since 1975. So they predate the creation of the Department of Ed. So I think that's something else that's important for people to remember. So Eliminating the
And
department.
it's not tied to the existence of the department.
Absolutely.
That's the most important part.
That's right.
I remember you saying this. I heard you say this, and I thought, oh, that's a really important point.
Absolutely. And so eliminating the department doesn't mean those protections or programs go away. This is where you need a comprehensive federal bill to actually say which programs are being eliminated. And there are most of them, I would argue, should be eliminated. But you keep IDEA, student loans, the portion that is kept, move that over either to Treasury or Small Business Administration.
Treasury.
Data collection.
I vote Treasury,
Yeah.
so we can take the axe to SBA.
Yeah. Data collection. You can move that over to the Department of Commerce, which manages the Census Bureau. So send it over to Census. Programs for Native American students should already be at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Move them over to BIE. So for every program that should stay, and again, there's just a handful of them, move them over to a more appropriate receiving agency. There are programs for military connected students, primarily impact aid, which is if there's like a large military base in a state and a displaced local property tax base as a result of that military base, the feds provide some additional federal funding to make up for it. So you can keep impact aid, move it over to DOD. So there's a more appropriate agency for all of the few federal programs that would remain. And so from a parent's perspective, you're still going to get funding. I would argue that for students with special needs in particular, there should be an additional reform, and that if families want, they could just receive that money directly rather than their kids assigned to a public school. You have to go through this potentially litigious process to get your money. You have to sit through these, IEP meetings that you should just be able to tap into your kids' money directly and pay for either private options or private tutoring or whatever it might be. So I think on a day-to-day basis, students and families are going to be much better off without a federal Department of Education.
So, and you've touched on this, the state free choice, school choice movement that's taking place, like really everywhere, it should actually kind of really help with all of this. Yeah. And do you see any barriers? Are you worried about a few states on that front? Are they states that are like not moving at all?
Yeah, they're always the Californias and New Yorks and Illinois of the world that are the problem children when it comes to education choice. Yeah. But look, eventually they'll get there, right? Eventually we will be to the point where they are the last 3 states that do monopoly provision of public education. And there will be enough competitive pressure on them that they will eventually come along. It might be a few years, but the people in those states need to speak to their local representatives, speak to their state legislatures, and make the case to get it done. And look, it's not just the blue states that are the problem. Right now, we're actively watching Texas. Texas does not have school choice. They may finally get it. It's crazy.
Yeah.
We've been saying for years they're finally going to get it, but I do think this year they're finally going to get it, and it may even be a universal ESA, which would be phenomenal. But we've even had trouble in places like Texas. But to the red states among our friends, I mean, it's not going to be enough anymore just to say we've got a low tax rate in our state. You're going to have that, and you're going to have to allow education freedom because families are highly mobile now, and they can move to places that do allow them to choose a school that is safe and effective and academically excellent and aligns with their values and doesn't try to do things behind their parents' backs.
Yeah, that's great. How does it help military families?
Yeah. So this is an interesting discussion because it is one of those very few areas where I think there could be a federal role to play, in that, unlike education, national security is an enumerated power and responsibility of the federal government. Mm-hmm. So put a pin in that. We know at the same time that 1/3 of service members have thought about leaving the military altogether because of the school their kid would have to attend at their next duty station. So just like a service member gets assigned to a duty station, their kid gets assigned to whatever closest school is next to that new duty station. And so and we already have recruitment and retention problems, vast recruitment and retention problems. So why not take that problem off the table and just say, we're going to fund you directly, military families, active duty military families.
To put your kids wherever you want.
To put your kid wherever you want. because I think there's a impression that military kids get to attend DoD schools and they're all excellent. DoD schools are good. Part of that might be selection of families that are there, but DoD schools do perform well. But only 4% of military kids attend DoD schools. 96% of them.
Is it because they don't exist everywhere?
Yeah, there just aren't very many of them, and they're all on the East Coast largely. So
I didn't even know they were DoD schools.
So 96% of military kids are attending, whatever public school is closest to their duty station. So that's a problem that could be alleviated by the federal government.
Yeah.
Along with, and the other two I would just add to that quickly are DC. DC is under the jurisdiction of Congress. So Congress should turn DC into an all school choice district. It should be universal formula funded ESA in Washington, DC.
And DC has been a first mover on the charter school.
Yeah, DC has been great on charters. Last I looked, which admittedly was a few years ago, it's like 44% of market share charters had in DC, which is great. And I know
that the unions are responsible for actually putting a cap on that 50%.
Yes. Well,
and I mean, they don't want a majority of the kids to be in charter schools.
That's right.
Yeah. That's, I remember a friend of mine telling me this.
Yeah.
They may be at 50 now. And then there's basically, the unions are demanding a guarantee.
Yeah. And the DC voucher program is similar in that when it was created in 2004,
is that the opportunity?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
the DC Opportunity Scholarship
and
program.
you're in that, I think you're in that movie, the Virginia.
I'm not in it, I don't think. But
or you're mentioned or something. I remember it's a great movie.
It is so good. Virginia Weldon Ford. She's was the mother of the DC voucher program. She's fantastic.
And I was actually going to ask you that 1999 report.
Yes.
That you mentioned. Is that the one that she finds in the movie, like that talks about school choice? I mean, I don't know. I mean,
I'll have to go back and watch.
Do you remember, in the movie, she finds she's a janitor in a congressman's office or something like this, and she finds that report about how much the federal government sends to the school.
I wonder if it's the Crossroads report. I will go back and look.
And
I don't remember.
Because she's helped by a congressman.
Yes.
That, and I can't remember the name, so I'm not. Anyway, I recommend the watching that movie.
Yeah.
It's called
Miss Virginia.
Miss Virginia.
Yep.
Yes, and it is really, and it's also horrifying because to think what this program has how much it has helped
that's right.
kids in failing schools in the district. And the fact that the Democrats have killed it, Obama killed it
every year.
I mean, it's just, you're just like, boiling rage.
Just quickly, I'll say it's been dying on the vine since it was created because it's subject to an annual appropriations process.
Yeah.
So to your point, Obama tried to zero it out every year in his budget. And then if you've got a hostile Congress, they try to kill it every year. And so because there's this political volatility built in to the funding model, fewer and fewer private schools have been participating over the years. So we've lost 2/3 roughly of the private schools that were participating in it.
Yeah, which defeats the purpose.
We don't have enough seats. And then they're also not increasing funding for it, and inflation's eating into the voucher amount. And so it's just not covering the cost. So anyways, we need to formula fund it, make it universal.
It's time to basically reform the whole thing.
We need to reform the whole thing. Yeah. But Congress should do that and could do that right now. So those are basically, and then last one I would add to that list are Native American kids in Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. They're the worst performing schools in the country. These kids perform 2 grade levels behind their Native American peers in public schools. The Native American kids who go to BIE schools, they're terrible. Mm-hmm. We're talking single-digit proficiency rates. And so those kids should be freed from those schools, and we can provide some private schooling options for those kids because there is that unique contractual obligation between Native American communities and the feds. Yeah. But the universe is pretty small for what the feds really can do and should do to advance school choice. But there are things they should be doing.
Well, so, it's not often that I end a podcast on a very feeling optimistic and happy. And so I want to have you back to kind of like, catch up on what's going on. And thank you so much, Lindsey. This was really great.
Thank you, Veronique. I really appreciate it.